My name is Travis Wayne Goodsell. This is a different video than the others I've been doing on my channel. This is going to be a long video, so those of you who don't like long videos, this video is going to be talking about how the Gospels are not myth, as critics of the Gospels are pushing, but they're also not accurate history during the Roman period. And so I'm going to explain to you that they are a part of apocalyptic literature. In order to understand apocalyptic literature, you need to understand the Jewish mindset. They're the ones who developed it, even though it comes from the Egyptians. So, to start with the Egyptians, you have their original story that predates the records. The pyramid texts are the oldest known textual document, whereas there are older king's lists, for example. And in the pyramid texts are discussions of various Egyptian gods, as if it's well understood by those writing it, such that it's based off of earlier stories. And so in the pyramid text, you have to collect the different points of each of the characters and combine them together to get a bigger understanding of who they are from the older documents. The main story that we've been able to identify of the Egyptians is that of Osiris, and that's the Greek name. Asher is the Egyptian name. And so I'll just continue to use the Greek names, as they're more of the popular understanding of the characters. And his battling his brother Set. Well, actually, he didn't put up much of a battle. He was immediately nailed in a coffin at a feast that was held by Set, also known by Seth. And Seth wanted to be the king. He was jealous of his brother being the king, even though his brother was the birthright blessing son of Geb and Nut, the parents. And so by nailing Osiris in the coffin, setting him afloat on the Nile, where he travels up to Byblos and turns into a tree, which Egyptologists don't really understand it. Nobody seems to really understand it until you look at the Jewish records of Isaiah and Jeremiah, who talk of the Messiah being called the branch. That's where it comes from. And Ezekiel also speaks of him, referring to him as the twig who is plucked off of the top of the branches of the cedars of Lebanon there in Byblos, and he's transplanted by an eagle. That's an apocalyptic literature, because that's what is being referred to here. Is in the Egyptian story, Even though Seth gets rid of his brother, and then Isis has her servants bring him back to Egypt. She brings him back to life. Seth finds out about it, chops up his body into 14 pieces this time, and scatters them throughout all the world. Then Isis sends her servants out to gather in those pieces from all over the world, and then she conceives before he ascends to heaven, and she gives birth to Horus. And Horus then is raised up, and when he's old enough, he then goes to Seth to battle him for the throne of his father, and that's the apocalyptic literature origin, is the son returning to battle the usurper king for the throne of his father, to be the restoring king. And Egyptian kings were pharaohs who were both the religious leaders and government leaders. And so the eyes of Horus represent the government and the religion of the people. And the two together are the word for seer, which is Peter. The very same. So when Jesus, in the gospel narrative, comes to Simon and says, "I'm changing your name to Peter, and upon this rock will I build my church." And the foundation of seership, referring to Peter as the pharaoh of the restored kingdom. And we all know how that turned out. All the apostles, including Peter, were assassinated, and those are legitimate. We do have confirmation that they did exist. It's just Jesus, we don't have confirmation of his existence outside of the Therapeutae, who had a teacher that walked around with 12 men, but there were a number of different Therapeutae groups of a teacher and 12 disciples who traveled around to the other Therapeutae groups. And so apocalyptic literature of the Jews comes from this ancient Egyptian story that permeated the whole Egyptian language, culture, practice, government, religion of Egypt. Everything was done based on that main story of the good king being murdered, his kingdom being usurped, and the son of the good king rising up to take back the throne of his father from the uncle. And that's the basis upon which all apocalyptic literature is based. So when we get to the Jewish period during the Romans, this is after their Babylonian captivity, and despite being set free by Cyrus of Persia, they still have the Greeks to deal with, as today being the first day of Hanukkah this year, celebrated from the Maccabean revolt that took back the temple in Jerusalem, and the 8 days that the oil lasted in the temple, when it miraculously did so and wasn't supposed to, but did, and thus Hanukkah. Though the 5th day, which is during the new moon, is the dark day of Hanukkah, and that has symbolic significance in John's apocalyptic literature, as he gives it one of the dates for the sign of the dragon on what turned out to be the 5th day of Hanukkah, the dark day. And so during this Roman period, many Jewish scholars and scribes were writing apocalyptic literature. And as we recognize, not much of it made it into the current canon of the Christians, because it was mostly written by Jewish authors, but yet didn't make it into the Jewish canon. And as a result, we have to understand that the apocalyptic literature still must be understood in the context of the canon scripture. Not supposed to be separated. And so the Gospels were also written during this time period. And so the Zeitgeist movement scholars who are talking about the Gospels as just being myth, and therefore we should dismiss them as literature, are really incorrect in that. The Gospels are essential, one, for not only confirming previous Egyptian documents, but also for giving us an understanding of the apocalyptic mindset of the Jewish Christians in the Roman period. And so let me go into Matthew, and we'll go over some stuff in there, and I'll explain the apocalyptic nature. The Gospels are not typical with apocalyptic literature because there't no dreams of beasts and weird creatures and magical stunts by these magical beasts. In the Gospels, what you have instead is an anthropomorphizing in the character of Jesus, who in the beginning represents Horus as the child of Osiris, and then in part is battling to restore the kingdom of his father, but he is murdered as his father was murdered. And so the author merged the two characters of Horus and Osiris into one character that he named Jesus. And so where does the name Jesus come from? Because that's not supposed to be his name. Those of you who are familiar with the writings of Isaiah, he specifically gives us the name Emmanuel, which is not God with us, by the way. It's the Egyptian god Amun, Amun-El. And that has significant understanding when you realize that the 18th dynasty, the David-Moses dynasty of the Taut-Mosed dynasty, phonetically the same, started the belief, and it was actually Hatshepsut who started it, by claiming that her mother, the queen, was impregnated by the god Amun and gave birth to Hatshepsut. And therefore, she had the right to rule on the throne in the absence of a pharaoh, legitimate pharaoh. David Moses, Tawut Mose II, died early, as David Moses III was still too young to reign on the throne as pharaoh all by himself. And so there wasn't a chance to be a co-regency, and so Hatshepsut told this to the Amun priesthood, and they agreed, yes, okay, we'll allow you to be the female pharaoh for the second time in Egypt's recorded history. Like I said, there was a king's lists that are indicate a lineage of authority for Egypt going back beyond Narmer or Scorpion King or whatever scholars argue over as the first pharaoh of Egypt. And so Hatshepsut considered herself as foreordained to that position, as she appealed to the Amun priesthood about that as well, that the Council of the Gods had decided before the earth was created that she was to come down to earth during that period of time, knowing that the Thutmose, David Moses II, was going to die early before the son was able to be old enough. And this is also where we get an understanding of the Immaculate Conception, as Christians wrongfully call it. There's documents in Egypt of this birth of the successive king, where the queen is getting impregnated, then gives birth to the heir to the throne of Egypt. And so Jesus then comes from the name of Joshua in Hebrew, Jesus being the Greek form of Joshua, the Hebrew form. So the book of Joshua then is the book from which the gospel authors are referring to by calling him Jesus, which means they understood that the book of Joshua was apocalyptic literature and not historical literature, as even Jews believe it is. And this explains why scholars can't connect the stories and events in the book of Joshua with those in the archaeological record in the land of Israel. And because Jericho, for example, was destroyed on several occasions, none of which were during the time frame which Jewish scholars, regular scholars, and Christian scholars believe the time frame for that Joshua event took place. And you can't just move your timeline to fit your perception of things. You have to look at the archaeological record to realize that the particular author was not intending to get a historically accurate portrayal there. And when you factor in apocalyptic literature, then it all becomes clear. Because Moses himself is the story about apocalyptic literature as well. And I've done my research to show that the whole Torah is apocalyptic literature. That the whole Tanakh, the writings and the prophets, are all referring to their Messiah, symbolically through the story characters, or directly in messianic terms. And the story of Moses, for example, is another example of how he starts off as the Horus character, the son, being raised up to confront Pharaoh, the usurping brother, but then the end of Deuteronomy has him gone, and he doesn't take the house of Israel into the promised land. That's left open for the book of Joshua to then step in and say he's the one who takes him into the promised land. And then that turns Moses into Osiris, and Joshua then becomes Horus. And so the Jesus of the Gospels is based on the book of Joshua, the book of Jesus, which is apocalyptic literature, because Joshua is the one who actually battles to get the house of Israel into the land of promise and restore the kingdom. And by the way, the kingdom of David, Talut Mosed dynasty, which Moses was a part of, as much of his stories revolve around Pharaoh Akhenaten of the 18th dynasty. And so we get to Matthew chapter 1 verse 1 says, the book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham, and then it goes into a genealogy from Abraham, and down to David. And they purposely set it up so that there's 14 generations. Again, Osiris's body was chopped up into 14 pieces, spread throughout all the world, and so the gathering needs to be of the 14 tribes, 14 pieces of Osiris's body, who are the descendants. There's symbolism in the Egyptian story, which is portrayed throughout the Old Testament, the Torah, and in the prophets and in the writings. And so with this understood, it's Joshua as Horus, and he's Christ, which is Hebrew for Messiah, which means anointed, the king. So Jesus the king, the anointed king, it's understood that he's a king by saying he's anointed. And so it's the book of the genealogy of Horus, the anointed king, to restore the kingdom of his father, which was of the 18th dynasty as son of David. David being the Talut dynasty, the Talut Moseds. And in the book of Kings, also the book of Samuel, first and second books of Samuel, and then the first and second books of Kings, which are also all the books of Kings, depending on which version of the Bible you're getting. The son of David is Solomon. In the passage where Isaiah gives us that great Christmas hymn through, can't remember the composer, but unto us a child is born, unto us a child is given. One of his titles is the Prince of peace. A prince is a son who is heir to the throne as the king. And so peace, if you know your Hebrew, is Salem. So Prince of Salem, the heir to the throne of Salem. Solomon, Salem, with the nun at the end. As one who has deciphered Paleo-Hebrew, I've deciphered the vocabulary as well. For example, the nun is a determinative, and when it's placed at the end of a word, if that word represents a land, then the nun identifies it as the kingdom of. So Babylon, the kingdom of Babel. That's simple enough. When it's attached to a name, it's then the king. So King Salem, King Shemesh, Samson, the Sun King. Again, that's another apocalyptic literature. It's intended to be placed specifically as if it were the time period to fill in the gaps in history. Unfortunately, it wasn't a historical event. It was apocalyptic literature. And so what you're seeing here is they're claiming Jesus is actually Solomon, because Solomon is the one who is the son of David, and becomes the heir to the throne. And so Jesus, in this context, if he's the son of David, they're calling him Solomon, the king of peace, the king of the land of Salem, the kingdom of Salem. And so they're actually diminishing his title, because he was the actual Solomon was among the 18th dynasty, and their rule during the 18th dynasty was all of Egypt, all the way up to the Euphrates River, especially when Tutmose the fourth, I think, might have been the third, the son, who took over when he was old enough to replace his mother. But so much to memorize. And I don't memorize, I get reference books. And here I am winging it. And so the technical inheritance, or land of inheritance, or the promised land for the Jews is technically the whole of Egypt all the way up to the Euphrates River. Unfortunately, it's been far too many millennia, and the apocalyptic literature also indicates that's also too small of a region. He's going to be the ruler of all the world. So all nations, kings, and thrones will be tributary to this Horus of the latter days in apocalyptic literature. And so the Jews are fighting a losing battle. But there you have, in the very start of Matthew, he's referring to apocalyptic literature, referring to the name Jesus as Joshua is the Horus, who is the rightful heir to the kingdom of his father, and also referring to him as Solomon, the son of David, There was a firstborn son of David's who died. So even though David didn't die, as he should have, if the author was correct on his writing, instead he made the firstborn son of David and Bathsheba die, and then Solomon takes over as the successor to the throne. So you can sort of see the alterations that people make with the stories in apocalyptic literature as they want it to be a certain way and stray from the original story of the Egyptians. And so you have to have him come through Judas. Judas is the Greek form of Judah, and that's phonetically the same as Utah. I keep telling Mormons this, and they don't seem to catch on or care or believe. But there's interesting symbolisms if they would just listen. And so you have all of the pertinent people here: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the usurper. And so all of these also retell the apocalyptic story of Osiris being murdered by his brother, and then Horus usurping the throne. In fact, Jacob means usurper in Hebrew, and Jacob usurps the birthright blessing from his brother Esau, and Esau marries a Canaanite woman named Judith. So it's all tied in together there with the symbolisms and the naming of people. And Isaac, when Jacob puts on the hairy coat of skin, goes to get the blessing away from Esau to give to him instead, which his mother prompted him to do. And Isaac is blind. And then the bowl of porridge that Jacob gives to Esau to trick him out of his birthright, all of that straight from the Egyptian records with the battle of Horus and Set. And then you even go to Adam's children, Cain and Abel. Cain murders his brother Abel, and the biblical author decides to he doesn't want Cain to be the father of Noah, so he replaces Cain with the Egyptian usurper, Seth. And so Noah comes through Seth, which is how Horus wins the battle against Seth. And that's, again, involves the branch title that he gets from Isaiah and Jeremiah. But again, Egyptologists don't understand it because they don't go into the Bible research. And people who do Bible research don't go into the Egyptian records. You got to do both. You got to set aside the taboo and join the two together. And it's just eye-opening. And so the birth of Jesus, you have Mary, who again, they don't have her document in the Gospels. They left that out. But Mary was a temple worker, 14-year-old girl, brand new in the temple, which is why Joseph thought that he was getting a virgin. And so it's not that she was immaculately conceived, it's that she was a temple prostitute. And she had not given birth yet, and oops, somebody got her pregnant when Joseph bought her. But that's the story they're telling, not the not the actual history. And the story that they're telling is taken from the Egyptian records about the apocalyptic literature. And so they symbolize 14 generations, as I already mentioned, and then they even include Babylon here, which I explained with the determinative nun. And so there technically wasn't 14 generations from Abraham to David and 14 from Babylon to Christ. It was much more than that. But they're purposely symbolizing here. And the Matthew author is also continuously talking about thus was fulfilled. Thus was fulfilled. He's trying to make the claim that the apocalyptic literature was fulfilled with his character Jesus, which he's writing in retrospect about, of whom he never knew and wasn't even born during that time period. He's just taking the Roman time period many decades later and claiming that there was such a person and he did do all these things as spoken of in the Egyptian documents. And so he's taking the Egyptian documents, putting them in his book, the Gospel, and saying that it all occurred, it all happened. Horus came and there's now peace. Unfortunately, no, that's not the case, was it? The Romans still dominated, and then Constantine usurped the Christian religions, following that same pattern. And Constantine's church, even though it has shattered into the many rocks of Daniel's dream, of the head of gold and so on down to the clay feet that shatter, as the story goes in Daniel. You have let's see, yep. So they say, and they shall call his name Emmanuel. Oops, I called him Jesus instead. And then they make the incorrect, which being interpreted, that's the redactor putting that in there, and he's diverting God with us. And that's later Hebrew translation for being people, or also the with, the word with, and then N is used as a plural pronoun, and so God with us is what they got from that. That's just to avoid connecting him with the Egyptian god Amun. And so virgin shall be with child. Virgin also, if you've seen Zeitgeist and others who have talked about it, that also refers to the virgin constellation, Virgo. Because when he's born in Bethlehem, that has to do with the star of the main star in her left hand, where she's holding the sheaf of wheat. That's the house of bread, is what it means in Hebrew. And so that star, not constellation as the movie claims. Excuse me. Although the word for house, Beth, also is the word for woman, or daughter, Baith, and except that in Egyptian, when you refer to the house, you're referring to the queen. And so Pharaoh, the text claims that it's the daughter of Pharaoh who finds Moses in the river Nile and raises him as her own child. No. Single women do not get to raise children all by themselves. This was the queen of Pharaoh who found the child and raised him, according to the story, according to the apocalyptic literature source origin. And then Judea is just another name for Judah, land of Judah. And so the Herod then becomes the period piece character to represent the fulfillment of the older versions. And so Herod is the usurping king, Seth, as Jesus is Horus, who's to retake the throne. And so you have the wise men, who are the belt of Orion pointing to the Sirius star, which represents Horus, and the Christmas, if you saw the movie Zeitgeist, explain it for you. And they're saying they were following the Sirius star and saw his sign. And actually this year, there's more to that sign that connects it to the biblical account. I've done that video elsewhere. I'm not going to put it in here. And so Herod then says, "Where is he that is born," or no, the wise men say, "Where is he that is born King of the Jews, the Messiah, to restore the kingdom of the 18th dynasty, David, the Tawut Moses, David Moses's, for we have seen his star in the east and are here to worship him." And so Herod says, "Oh, I don't like this idea." And so he gets his astrologers. They say, "Oh, Bethlehem of Judea." No. This is altered for the different culture than the Egyptians. So it's written by a Jew trying to get the ancient characters to conform to his culture, the Jewish culture, under Roman rule. And so he's altering the text of the Egyptians by renaming the characters and renaming the lands that are discussed. And the star and the frankincense and myrrh, that's all part of the burial ritual of the Egyptians for mummification. Except for the gold is what you pay for it for. But the frankincense and myrrh were used in the mummification. And so that's a little bit curious, because you're not supposed to mummify a baby. So they're mixing in Osiris with Horus in that part. And then so God warns the wise men not to return to Herod and go back to where they came from. And then let's see. And then Joseph then has a dream. So again, dreams are a part of this. Just as Joseph of Egypt was involved with dream interpretation as a seer. The prophet Samuel, who was dropped off by his mother, who made a promise that if you give me a son, I'll give him to the temple and he will serve you in the temple. And so Eli became the caretaker of Samuel. And it was said that Samuel was a prophet. In olden times it was referred to as a seer. And so again, Peter. And dreams are a part of seership. And so Joseph was a seer. Interesting, Reuben is Ra, which is seer in Hebrew, and Ben, which is son in Hebrew. So the son of the seer, making Jacob, the usurper, the seer. And Reuben, being the birthright blessing son, supposedly is the one who is supposed to be the son of the seer as the next succeeding seer, except Joseph is then born and usurps the birthright blessing from Reuben. See, again, that whole pattern is interwoven throughout the Torah stories. And here it is being exemplified in the gospel stories. And so here it is, the first fulfilled. So when Joseph goes to Egypt, you see, this is where the author, even though he's changed the names to Jewish names, and he's changed the places to places in Jerusalem, he still has to get it to conform to the ancient prophecies that it's all in Egypt. And so he says, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, "Arise, take your young child and mother, and flee into Egypt," which is part of the Egyptian story. The Isis, the wife of Osiris, who conceived Horus, the young child, fled into the wilderness because Seth heard about it and wanted to destroy her and her son, because she would be, or he would be, the usurper to the throne, the threat. And thus, where Moses and babies are threatened for their lives, and Jesus and babies are threatened for their lives, because it comes from the ancient Egyptian story of Seth wanting to kill the child, because he would usurp, or not usurp, but restore the kingdom of the true king. And so let's see. And they departed into Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the Lord by the prophet, saying, "Out of Egypt have I called my son." See what he's doing there? And Moses' story does it as well, is that Moses isn't an Egyptian, but he gets into Egypt and is raised up in Egypt. And the Jesus author is trying to pull the same stunt because they do not want an Egyptian character being talked about, because he's wanting it to relate to the Jews. Just like Daniel. Daniel was a post-captivity Jewish writing, either in the Greek period or in the Roman period. And it's specifically written to the Jews, not as an actual history, but as a rebuke of the Jews who were conforming to the culture of either the Greeks or the Romans, by using the story of Daniel during captivity time period, where the Jews were tried to be forced to become Babylonian. And if you know anything about the Jews' culture, their calendar comes from Babylon, with the Sabbath day, the seventh day, coming from Babylon. And a lot of their writings, their language was altered even. Paleo-Hebrew turned into Hebrew, which was Semitic. What I deciphered with the Paleo-Hebrew script and then vocabulary was that it was not Semitic. It conformed more to Paleo-Greek, which is not Semitic either. And both of those were more closely associated with Egyptian, even though they're alphabets and not the ideographic picture language of Egyptians. And so Daniel was written specifically to tell his society of Jews, hey, remember Daniel from Babylon how he stood up against the king of Babylon to defy changing to their culture, their gods, their language, their calendar, blah, blah, blah. And, of course, the book of Daniel failed because the Jews still carry on with the Babylonian cultures and traditions and practices and gods and blah, blah, blah. Because El is a Canaanite god, whereas Yah is an Egyptian god. The first pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, mind you, in that Yah is the first pharaoh, Yah Moses, Yah Mose. And it refers to the god of the moon. So you can see why the Jews would merge Yah with the lunar calendar of the Babylonians, although the religious calendar of the Egyptians is lunar. Okay. So then Herod then sees that he was mocked and wants to kill babies. And then again, this author for Matthew says, "Then was fulfilled that which was spoken of by Jeremy," or Jeremiah, "the prophet, saying, In Ramah was a voice heard, lamentation and weeping and great mourning." So that's what the whole Gospel of Matthew focuses on, is that all of the Egyptian stories, calls them prophecies, and turns them into a Jewish narrative during the time of the Romans to inspire the Christians, so that they would believe that the Messiah has come, and therefore they don't need to look anymore for a Messiah to come. And the second coming of Jesus was never understood back in those early Christian days. Jesus had come, everything was fine. There was no need to look for another Messiah once Constantine whipped everybody into conformity. And so you can see some Constantinian influencing on these texts. But the apocalyptic literature still carries on, and so every time the Jews are greatly persecuted, as they get kicked out from country to country, it's necessary for them to remember the apocalyptic literature of the Torah and the Tanakh, to remind them that they may still have a hope someday. And then Christians, it's mostly evangelicals now that push for the book of Revelation to come true, which, if you understand astronomy, and understand that when you're talking about certain alignments and conjunctions, you're giving a precise date in time. John the Revelator gives us several precise dates in the future which have already happened. 2017, 2018. Kind of cool. And interesting how events on Earth are corresponding to this ancient Egyptian apocalyptic literature. As Trump has his mark of the beast on the forehead as they wear their MAGA hats, and the image of Trump is spewing blasphemies at his rallies, covered by Fox News, and so it's kind of cool. And then you have the dragon, who controls both the beast, which would correspond to Trump, and Putin therefore is the dragon. Then you have the false prophet, and that's where Mormons come in, because the total solar eclipse that happened in 2017 was on the Egyptian New Year. That never happens because it's on the religious calendar, which varies in the date of the New Year on our calendar, which means it's never on the same day. And so for the total solar eclipse to occur on the New Year, never happens before, never happens again. Once in forever situation. And that corresponds with the apocalyptic story of Horus at the beginning of the battle losing his right eye. The movie version, Gods of Egypt, has him losing both eyes right at the beginning, and he's an adult already. So they sort of messed up the story, but you do get an understanding of what was in the original stories. And then he loses his left eye as well, before getting them restored and winning the battle against Set and taking back the throne. And so it's fascinating to see it all played out in real time. And everybody's clueless because nobody knows about this connection. But oh well. So I think that's sufficient to give you a starter on how the Gospels are apocalyptic literature. And as much as people want to insist that their God is real, even though they claim he's supernatural and therefore cannot be real, and cannot even be understood to be supernatural because we're real and therefore can't comprehend the supernatural, which is really unsound in its logical or illogical claims, fallacious claims. It's unrational, therefore, for people to get upset with others who scientifically try to tell the truth, as they claim that science is fake news and we need to do away with science and promote the mythological tales as scientific truth instead. But if you understood the origin of the tales, you would understand that the Jesus of the Christians is actually the Horus of the Egyptians, or Osiris of the Egyptians, depending on which Christ, which Jesus you're referring to. So the Jews, for example, they give more loyalty to Moses than they do to Joshua, as Moses is the major focus of the Torah, and Joshua is a book outside the Torah and is just a character in Moses's command, as the book, as it tries to harmonize with the book, or the book tries to harmonize with the Torah. All right, so there's your introduction to the Gospels as apocalyptic literature, not myth.